Hello there and welcome to Building with Bits. My name is Chisel, and in a previous episode, using the little tiles mod, I built a recreation of the scaled map. If you haven't seen that yet, please feel free to go and watch it after this one. Right now though, we are returning to the same theme, building the next map from the Among Us game, Mira HQ. Beginning once again on a completely blank canvas, I spam down some blocks until a bunch of familiar shapes appear, using a few different colours just so you guys can clearly see what's going to be going where. And just like last time, the cafeteria is the first to be granted an existence. Starting off on the floor with a fairly simple grid design, just an off-white panel with a darker border, but then coming back over the top with a bunch of different colours in an alternating pattern. Here I'm using the paintbrush tool, which allows me to simply colour over blocks I've already placed. Then, after coming around to build up all the walls, we use our brush to add a rainbow style design to the back wall. And I don't know, there's something about watching someone literally paint in Minecraft that's kind of mesmerizing. Anyway, with the floor and walls pretty much done, we get to work on the furniture, starting with those 4 large orange tables in the middle, the serving table and the vending machines on the side, and then finally coming around to complete the rest of the tasks. So looking alright so far. Now I've tried to make each task have at least some interaction, starting with the emergency buttons, openable and pressable. Pretty cool. Next up we got the vending machine. Not too complicated here, you can just open up the bottom to grab your drink out. And the rubbish task with a lever you can actually pull to release that garbage into space. Takes a little while. And finally, the diverted power task, which can even be activated so you can accept that power. Now, we also have the wires down here on the bottom too, though this is just a visual as I really couldn't think of a way of making this working and still actually looking as good. On that subject, finally, we have my attempt at pixel art. F in the chat to pay your respects. Moving swiftly on to the storage room, designing a simple checkerboard pattern for the floor, layering the inside walls with a marble style brick, which on its own actually looks really good. And then, since this room has a lot of details like boxes, books and various other little objects, we also don't really have too much room to play with, so I take a different approach, building up the individual assets we need first, afterwards then adding in all the shelving. We finalize the room by copying all the little details we built first. And I mean all the little details. Like, there's so much going on in this tiny room. I love it. Right down the end here, we even have the watering can. I figured a bucket of water you can then take to actually water the plants made the most sense for this task. Let me know what you think. Jumping outside, I lay down the darkened wooden floor texture for the balcony, edging the walkway with a dark rim and glass banister, then starting work on one of the more interesting floor designs I've come across yet. See, while hexagons are really easy to build with in real life since they form a tessellation, it means they tile perfectly across a flat plane. The obvious blocky nature of Minecraft makes it rather difficult to find something that fits the proportions well and actually looks good. Finally settling on this pattern, we then slide across to the other side, designing a small weather console, and as with most of the consoles on this map, it's quite simply a box with a slope on top. Obviously we then come around to add a bunch of detail with the paintbrush and some little buttons too, but the basic premise remains the same. Sliding back across now, we finally get started on what I'd say was the main feature out here, the satellite dish. Well, the base first anyway, so with a good template modeled out, I move away from the main build. Now, I want to make the dish itself capable of rotating around so it can line up with the direction it should be scanning, which makes sense, right? So obviously starting with the base, I then build up the central pivot. This will spin around from left to right, then designing the satellite dish itself, which will rotate up and down. Now, combining these components together, we can then create something that rotates in any desired direction. Let me show you how that works. Right, let's start with the console over the back here. This houses the weather task, nothing too complicated, just a simple chart which displays results you have to wait for, just like in game. And on the other end of the balcony, we have the satellite dish, which I gotta say, just looks so cool now it's all set up. And activating it, you can see it smoothly lines up with the direction that it's meant to point on the original map too. I actually can't get over how good this looks. This is mad. Finally, to finish off the balcony area, we need the two big glass double doors that separate it from the cafeteria. Minorly annoying to build like this with glass when you can't always see where you're placing the block exactly. You get the same problem when building with pure black as well, to be fair, but these doors seem to have a rather magical property on Mira, as they seem to just disappear into the walls when you open them. I, however, actually had to make sure the doors had enough physical room to move when you open them up. So, they don't quite open all the way, but it's certainly more than enough to be functional and still looks pretty good in my opinion. Appearing on the other side of cafeteria, we start work on the glass bottom walkway that connects up the three main sections on the right hand side. I can't lie, this is one of the parts I was a little bit worried about, to say the least. Not because it's overly complicated, mind you, just the way that I was doing a lot of the angled walls you see in my last map, the recreation of Skeld, well, it tended to soak up a lot of time and small, repetitive actions. So, with this firmly implanted in the back of my mind, I tried to be as modular as I could, and there is definitely something to be said for repetitive practice, because just getting the basics laid out took me no longer than half an hour. And then, with the addition of the support rails underneath, all in all, it took just over an hour to build this entire walkway. With the additions of the lights lining the walls too, we have something that almost looks like it's been pulled straight out of the original game. Now, for the top section of the map, we begin with the admin room. Seemingly getting more and more complicated as we progress, I lay down the first layer of the floor, filling in the walls, then designing a cross pattern for the second higher layer, all while making sure to leave enough space for that big table with the map display in the center. As you can probably tell, it takes a lot of time to build all these tiny buttons, details, and screens and stuff, but for some reason, I barely even notice it go by. I do love it when that happens. Moving over to the left hand side, we have the office. I really like the floor design in here, with the opposing lines. It actually looks kind of trippy, would probably work really well in the real world as like a bathroom floor or something along those lines perhaps. Regardless, much like the storage room, there are quite a few standalone details, so taking a similar approach, we build most of the assets we need, save a copy, and then once I've sorted the layout, simply come around at the end and place everything in. What a result! I am still continually surprised by what this mod is capable of producing. We even have an openable lights panel with actual flickable switches. It's too bad we can't yet connect them up to actual lights with like redstone and stuff, but I do believe that's something being worked on in at least the long term, so one day that could actually be a thing. Anyway, I digress. For now, moving into the center, we finish up the walkway in between admin and the office. The only minor change I made being to move the wires task onto the side wall, since there realistically wasn't enough space with the door to the greenhouse taking up so much of the back wall, so yeah, that seemed an adequate compromise since it's still pretty much in the same place. Next, we slide up to design this this giant glass monstrosity. A huge, semi-circular greenhouse. Probably not the first thing you think of when it comes to a chilled evening building in Minecraft. But with the tools gifted to me by the almighty little tiles mod, I am somehow capable of building a completely symmetrical, semi-circular glass room without even counting a block. Some would say these tools are a little OP. To them, I say you're missing out. Next, we create the crossbeam supports, we then copy them underneath the glass floor, and finally, filling in all the walls, we can move on to some internals. For starters, there are a few different types of plants, as you'd expect to find in a greenhouse. In the longer pots, I built some bushes and what looks to be some sort of blue grass. I don't know. And then designing the 4 individual plants, which are also the plants you're meant to water with the watering can found in the storage room. Now with these completed, I move them to their appropriate positions, making sure to get my spacing just right. We then come down to finish off this final centerpiece, another weird looking plant. This one seems to be made of some sort of alien flower tree that's floating. I don't know, it's rather weird, but it certainly looks pretty. With the additions of the final plant pots and tasks, the entire top section of our map is now complete. So with the whole right side of the map pretty much done, minus the vents, which I haven't forgotten, don't worry, I will be adding those in at the end, we continue on the main hallway down through the central area. The wood panel texture here was a pretty simple base design, and then just painting those different shades over the top makes it really pop out. The second part of the floor wasn't quite as straightforward. I had to try to replicate that custom pattern so it could be tiled over many blocks and not look too repetitive. Didn't look too amazing, so I came back, I took some out, rotated them around and replaced them just to help give it some more randomness, which pretty much worked perfectly. Then, finishing off the walls, I also tried my hand at some more pixel art alongside the little O2 task there. And of course, the cute little paintings of the Among Us characters too. Couldn't forget those. Now, this middle section contains 3 rooms, the first of which is communications. Not too complicated, a simple grid pattern for the first layer of the floor, dark walls with that nice deep purple hue. Then installing the second layer on either side of the rooms, we then add in the desks, equipment, and little details. Slight problem with the flower pot though. Seems I hadn't quite left enough room between the tables, but to be fair, the entire bottom left corner has nothing in it, so I figured I'd give it some love and move it down there instead. Moving down, and unlike the last room, the floor in this one has a bit more to it. So after sectioning it off, I manually start painting on the original design, or as close to it as I could realistically get. I think it turned out alright, and with that floor bit done, I relined up the door so it's perfectly center, and then finish off the simple design for the walls. Now, the main feature left to build in here is the beds, and considering the design, I clearly couldn't miss an opportunity to make something move. So, we build up the separate components of the bed first, allowing us to do something really cool with the Little Tiles mod. And I think I can safely say I succeeded in that. With the power diverter task on the wall and obviously the scanner pad too, we can finally move on to the last room in this section, the locker room. Starting with a singular floor tile, basic design with just diagonal lines, which we can rotate as it's placed to achieve the same diamond pattern that we see in the original design. I also noted that a couple of the lockers are left open in here. I instead decided to make all of the lockers with openable doors, and the benches also sittable as well. Then finally designing the little tiled mats that you see on the floor. Sliding up to decontamination, I quickly placed down a basic floor for the top section just so I can build that semicircle entranceway on either side. And once I was happy with the basic shape, I then finished off the main design for the room, finally coming around with an extra sweep of detail, and I gotta say, all those little tiles sticking out of the step really help to integrate the two sections together. Like, there's so much detail going on here, it's great. But as you can see, we are far from finished. Firstly, we need the door. Unlike a usual door which opens to the side, this one slides vertically, which actually makes it easier for us as we can just build the one structure instead of having to build 2 separate opposing doors, which tends to get a bit more complicated. With some of the tools Little Tiles provides, I had a really cool idea for making the decontamination process actually come alive. And let me show you what I mean. So a little tour, starting with the locker room. I love the colors on the walls in here, and of course, all the lockers are openable. Quickly moving around, we have the decontamination process. So as I'm walking through here, here's a simple rundown of how this works. Firstly, we use the particle block provided by the Little Tiles mod, which allows you to summon any particle effect in the game and also give it a velocity, direction and speed. When doors move, they also block these particles. So combining these two things together, we've basically created little hatches along the side. These can then be opened and closed to allow the flow of particles from the blocks sitting beneath. And there it is. I really wasn't sure how this was going to turn out to start with, and as you can see, it took a fair amount of effort to get it properly working, but yeah, definitely worth it in the end. Next step, we come back up to finish the last little bit of hallway between the lab and reactor room. I am building these walls out of glass. They are see-through in-game, although they are originally only meant to be one-way glass. Unfortunately, I can't seem to be able to replicate this, so we're just going to have to suffice with simple glass walls. finishing it off adding in the boxes and wires task at the end, along with that labeling on the back wall too. Moving over to the right, the lab has a basic triangular patterned floor, pretty simple to build, but definitely the perfect aesthetic for a laboratory. Overall though, a fairly simple room, with the most complicated stuff obviously being the small details and visual representations of the tasks. The same can't really be said for the next room though. Yep, you guessed it, the reactor room. I think you can tell how difficult this was just from my tone of voice. This floor has so many layers, I wasn't even sure where to start. But we pressed on, and once we had the room split off into its sections, I simply focused on each section in turn, trying to capture as many details as I possibly could. Then once I had a design I was overall pretty happy with, I built up some separators along the walls, then creating the consoles, starting with the small one at the front, which houses the power diverter task. I also built up the two along the side and the other pair of consoles at the rear, you know, the ones with the little hand interface to stop the reactor overloading. The main central console will be used to activate the reactor, but we actually need said reactor to know where everything's going to fit, so we start building that first. And just showing you a snippet of that process, as you can see I use a simple frame that I manually built in order to measure out a perfectly round sphere. Using that, we can easily build that little small yellow sphere first, removing the frame for that, then build the bigger glass sphere surrounding the first. God, that's a mouthful. The end result being something that kind of resembles a big ball of energy. But with the giant plasma ball done, we start designing the containment arms which come down the sides. Those I assume house magnets, and that magnetic field is what's meant to be containing this fusion reaction. I will say though, I did have to take some rather major creative liberties when converting this room from 2D to 3D. Obviously that's quite a bit of a transformation, and with that comes a load of challenges too. One of those in particular being the ceiling. Because that's the thing, covering this sort of map up really takes away from the whole aesthetic of being able to look from the top down. And I certainly didn't want to ruin that aspect of these maps. However, in this case I also felt like just leaving a floating reactor there was not really doing it justice. So I compromised, building out a small section of the ceiling above to support the reactor, but giving it an effect like it was almost dissolving off into the game world. A bit different, but definitely interesting to see how it turned out. And here we are. On the central console there's actually a task in-game to start the reactor, so emulating that in Minecraft as best we can, we make the whole thing spin. Given the amount of time and sheer level of detail put in so far, I'm super happy with how this turned out. Like, this actually looks amazing. But we are not done yet. So, with the landing pad being the last area to finish, I bring out the walkway to meet it, a nice dark green colour to help break things up, and of course, that little glass railing along the edge too. Moving up to the pad itself, we design the floor, a pretty simple white box pattern, surrounded with that darker edging, just to clean things up. Then, measuring out just the right proportions, I paint on the black and yellow circles covering the surface. With the floor completed, I then design the angled metal fencing, which we see around the sides. Since all the edges didn't line up with standard Minecraft blocks, I had to place some temporary framing just to be able to copy in all the railings, but once everything was cleaned up, it certainly looked the part. Now, the next big thing to do is the spaceship. Not the easiest thing to get right, but it was certainly a fun challenge, and one I'd probably like to do again in the future, maybe with a proper spaceship. For now though, we build up the overall shape, adding in bezels and pretty much all the edges, then we use the paint tool to go over with the line work and extra detail like the door on the back and the roof, and of course the nacelles too. Now, I did run into a little trouble reaching everything here, so I simply moved the engines away from the main ship. There I could easily finish working on them and simply just copy them back in. Finally, since I almost forgot, adding in the completely necessary wings, we then have our completed spaceship. Looking at it, it's probably not flight worthy, but hey, it looks like the one on the map, so that's what I'm going with. Anyway, now I have a clear area to work with. I add in the giant cylindrical fuel tank, both of the consoles, and of course all the little boxes and fences and various little details too. But don't worry, we're still not quite finished, as the last task we have to do is the vents. I'm taking some time to build up something you can just about fit through, but at least looks pretty good with those slanted bars going across. Then finally, placing it appropriately throughout the